Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Kansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the late autumn of 1895, when the Kansas prairie began to turn from gold to gray, a young woman arrived at a property few locals dared to speak of openly. Her name was Eliza Monroe, a housekeeper sent from Wichita through an agency that handled placements for wealthy landowners. The carriage that brought her rattled to a stop before the Davenport Ranch House, a sprawling two-story residence set back from the main road, half hidden by tall cottonwoods and a curtain of winter haze. The man who owned the estate was Walter Davenport, a figure known across the county for both his wealth and his severity. Tall, gaunt, and dressed in black wool despite the shifting weather, Davenport welcomed the young woman with a tone of courtesy, though the chill in his eyes suggested something harder beneath. The house itself was richly appointed, a wide oak table polished to mirror sheen, heavy curtains drawn against the draught, portraits of solemn ancestors staring down from the walls. Yet even on her first evening, Eliza felt a peculiar stillness, as though every hallway held its breath. Old records from the county clerk's office, preserved in scattered ledgers, describe the Davenports as one of the more prominent ranching families of the Smoky Hills region. Walter's father, Amos Davenport, had secured his fortune through cattle drives in the 1870s, buying land when it was still cheap and building influence as towns like Fairbrook and Cedarvale grew around the rail line. Yet, like many frontier magnates, the family carried its share of whispered rumor. "The Davenports are fine to look upon," the one neighbor remarked in an affidavit years later, "but you will not find their hearts quick to trust." The Kansas frontier in that decade was still haunted by tales of violence and deception. Only 20 years earlier, the case of the Bloody Benders had shaken the state and made its way into national headlines. Families traveling west had disappeared at their inn, their remains later uncovered in shallow graves. Though the Benders were believed to have fled, their legend remained alive in every isolated farmhouse. Eliza, arriving decades later, could not have missed the echoes. In towns like Fairbrook, people still whispered, "Best keep an eye when a ranch house grows too quiet." On her first night, Eliza was shown to a small upstairs chamber. From the window she could see the fields stretch in every direction, dark under the moon, with only the silhouette of the barns to break the horizon. Somewhere beyond, a coyote called. The ranch, for all its wealth, felt untethered from the community around it. The nearest neighbor was a mile off, and the local marshal only passed by on occasional rounds. She later wrote in a letter, preserved only in fragments by a cousin in Wichita, that "the house is too large for its number, and the master walks as though measuring silence." It was, in many ways, an introduction not just to a new place of work, but to a mystery that would unfold in layers: family secrets, unexplained disappearances, and the eventual whispers of an act so grotesque it seemed drawn from the darkest corners of Kansas folklore. Eliza's early days at the Davenport Ranch were filled with unease rather than comfort. In testimony recorded decades later by a surviving ranch hand, she was described as a neat, quiet girl who kept to her work, though her eyes showed worry. The tasks given to her were typical: sweeping long corridors, polishing the dining room silver, and preparing plates under the strict direction of Walter Davenport himself. Yet the way meals were managed struck her as unusual. The rancher often dined alone, and he insisted that food be brought to him at set hours, behind closed doors. The house itself was grand, but strangely muted. Ornate carpets covered the main hall, and portraits of stern-faced Davenports lined the staircase. Yet whole rooms were kept locked. The butler, Gregory Ames, a man in his 50s with narrow shoulders and sunken eyes, was the one who enforced the restrictions. When Eliza asked about the locked cellar door, Ames replied curtly, "That is not for the staff." Such rules might have seemed ordinary in wealthier households, but in Cedarvale, where ranch families lived plainly and shared meals in open kitchens, this formality bred suspicion. Neighbors took notice too. A local preacher, Reverend Samuel Hodge, later gave a deposition in 1903 stating that he had only been invited into the Davenport home once in 30 years. "They spoke polite, but the welcome was thin," he recalled. Other townsfolk agreed. Walter Davenport kept his dealings in town brief, settling accounts at the bank or general store without lingering for conversation. In Fairbrook, the Davenport name became a synonym for distance. Eliza herself began to notice noises at night. Footsteps creaking across floorboards when the household should have been asleep, faint sounds from the cellar below. One evening, she swore she heard muffled voices, though she recognized none of the tones. She confided her fears to a fellow servant, a cook named Lydia Clark. Lydia, in later affidavit, testified, "Miss Monroe said the walls breathed whispers. I told her not to listen." Within a month, Lydia left her position without notice, walking to town before sunrise and never returning. Sheriff Elias Blair, who served the county in those years, kept a detailed log of complaints, some of which survive in the state archives. Among them are 2 notes regarding the Davenport property. The first, filed in November 1895, mentions unaccounted lights on upper floor observed by a patrol rider. The second, from late December, notes rumors of missing livestock and unease among hands employed on estate. Neither entry led to action at the time, but they stand today as early signals of what was to come. The Kansas frontier had long been shaped by isolation, and in that loneliness, fear often grew unchecked. As scholars of the state's darker history often remind us, the shadow of the Bloody Benders loomed large over any unexplained disappearance. People whispered that evil had once taken root in Kansas soil and could do so again. Eliza, though perhaps unaware of the full legacy, seemed to sense something was wrong. In her surviving letters she wrote, "The Master dines behind doors, and I cannot shake the thought that I serve not one, but 2. That cryptic line would later trouble investigators more than any other. For if Walter Davenport dined alone, who else was being served? By midwinter, the Davenport household had grown quieter still, though the silence seemed charged rather than peaceful. Surviving testimonies from neighboring ranch hands paint a picture of a property increasingly shrouded in suspicion. One worker, Thomas Keene, later told a county investigator, "There were nights the lamps burned long after midnight, but no one entered nor left. We would see shadows through the curtains, more than one shape, yet only Mr. Davenport was said to live there." Eliza Monroe kept up her duties, but her notes in a torn diary, later discovered among her cousin's belongings, hint at her mounting dread. She wrote of being ordered to serve heavy-covered plates to the dining room, then barred from entering until a bell was rung. She described the sound of a second chair scraping across the floor behind the locked door, and once the faint clink of a glass lifted in a toast. She never named another person, only wrote in one line, "There is a presence that does not pass by the front door." The butler Ames, when questioned much later, offered contradictory remarks. In one affidavit taken by Sheriff Blair, he insisted that only his employer ever dined in that room. Yet, in a separate interview, he let slip that the master prefers company only when it is not to be seen. Historians have debated this odd phrase, wondering whether Ames implied another family member concealed in the house, or whether he referred to gatherings hidden from the public. Around this time, disappearances began to draw wider attention. A ranch hand named William Turner was last seen riding toward the Davenport pasture, but never returned. His horse was found tethered in the barn, reins hanging loose, as though abandoned in haste. No search party found him. The Fairbrook Gazette ran a small item, "Local hand presumed lost in storm," though no storm had been reported that day. Near sister filed a statement at the courthouse demanding further inquiry, but little came of it. The case gained a darker hue when a traveling peddler, Jeremiah Cole, vanished on his route between Cedarvale and Arkansas City. His cart was discovered overturned near a creek bed, goods scattered, yet no sign of robbery. His money box remained intact. Local gossip turned quickly toward the Davenport ranch, as Cole had been last seen heading that direction to offer wares. One townsman, George Whitcomb, told authorities, "I warned him not to pedal up that road after dark. There are eyes at that house that see too much." Sheriff Blair again took interest, noting in his logbook that multiple disappearances now clustered near the Davenport estate. He visited the ranch but found nothing actionable. Walter Davenport received him in the parlor with practiced civility, offering tea and denying any knowledge of Turner or Cole. "This house is my sanctuary," he said flatly, "and I will not have it slandered." Still, whispers grew. Some ranchers compared the unease to stories of the Bloody Benders 2 decades earlier, whose crimes had shocked Kansas with shallow graves hidden on their property. "It is the same pattern," an old rancher muttered in 1896. "Folk go near and do not return." For Eliza, the atmosphere was unbearable. In one of her last surviving notes, she described opening the pantry to find a cloth bundle marked with a reddish stain, quickly taken from her by Ames before she could examine it further. "I know not what I saw," she wrote, "but I pray it was not what my heart feared." Her fears would soon be justified in a way that entered county record as one of the strangest and most disturbing frontier accounts. By early 1896, the air around the Davenport estate had shifted from private unease to public suspicion. Sheriff Elias Blair, under pressure from townsfolk and the families of the missing, returned to the ranch with 2 deputies. His official notes, fragments of which remain preserved in the county archive, described the property as immaculate in appearance, yet uncanny in spirit. Davenport received the lawmen calmly, dressed in black, his silver watch chain glinting in the firelight. He granted them access to the main hall, parlors, and kitchen, but not the cellar. Blair's log mentions the refusal plainly. When asked for keys to the basement, Mr. Davenport smiled thinly and declared it was used only for storage and was in disarray unfit for guests. The sheriff recorded his unease, noting the faint odor of dampness and something not unlike iron drifting from beneath the stairwell. His deputies confirmed hearing a low thud, as though a door below had been hastily closed. Rumors multiplied in town. At the general store, locals recalled Davenport purchasing heavy amounts of lime, ostensibly for soil treatment. Others noticed the disappearance of a hired cook, Lydia Clark, who left so suddenly that her wages went uncollected. One ranch wife told the Gazette reporter, "She left before dawn, face pale as milk. She said only, 'I cannot serve what he asks.'" Eliza Monroe's situation grew perilous. Letters she attempted to send to Wichita reportedly never arrived. In a draft found later among her belongings, she described being ordered to deliver a plate to Davenport at midnight, the contents hidden under a silver lid. She wrote of hearing a second voice in that room, hoarse and low, speaking words she could not decipher. "I am made to serve not only the master," she wrote, "but another whose presence shuns daylight." In March of that year, the sheriff secured a warrant to conduct a more thorough search, citing growing pressure from families of the missing. Before the search could be executed, however, Davenport's butler Ames appeared at the courthouse in Fairbrook. He seemed nervous, hands trembling as he gave a brief statement. According to the clerk's transcription, "There are rooms in that house best left closed. I have seen plates carried to doors no servant may enter." Before more questions could be asked, Ames fled the county, boarding a northbound train. The planned search was delayed by a spring storm that flooded roads, but locals claimed strange activity at the ranch during those weeks. Lights were seen in the upper floor at odd hours. A teamster swore he spotted Davenport digging near the stables under lantern light. When he called out, Davenport straightened, then extinguished the lamp. The ground where he had been seen was later found freshly packed, though nothing was unearthed at the time. The case was beginning to resemble something out of Kansas folklore itself, echoing tales of the Bloody Benders, who had hidden their victims beneath trapdoors. Scholars today often point out how the memory of that earlier crime shaped the perception of Davenport's behavior. Yet while the Benders fled before arrest, Walter Davenport remained calmly in place, insisting on his innocence, his wealth shielding him from immediate consequence. The atmosphere of suspicion thickened. Sheriff Blair wrote in one frustrated entry, "The townsfolk believe another Bender walks among them. Yet proof remains elusive, and Davenport stands with the composure of a man daring accusation." It was into this climate that Eliza Monroe vanished. One morning in late April, her chamber was found empty, her few belongings packed as though for departure, though no carriage was summoned and no ticket was purchased in her name. She had disappeared as completely as those she feared had gone before her. Eliza Munro's disappearance marked a turning point. What had been whispers and suspicions became open alarm. Families of the missing pressed the sheriff to act, and the Fairbrook Gazette printed an editorial demanding a complete and unsparing search of the Davenport estate. The pressure forced Sheriff Blair's hand. By early May of 1896, he assembled deputies and returned to the property with explicit orders. The search began in the stables, where neighbors had reported seeing Davenport digging at night. Under patches of soil near the rear fence, the men unearthed fragments, shreds of cloth, a cracked boot heel, and what the coroner later described in his report as splintered remains consistent with human bone. The fragments were too small for identification, but the discovery was enough to justify expanding the search. Attention turned at last to the cellar. Davenport resisted, arguing it was no place for inspection and claiming his property rights. The deputies forced entry regardless. What they found was not the vast chamber of legend, but a series of narrow rooms, unfinished stone walls damp with groundwater. One room contained barrels of lime. Another held a long wooden table, deeply scarred and stained. Sheriff Blair's notes, though cautious, remark on the condition of the wood. Indelible marks, not consistent with simple butchering of livestock. The most disturbing find was a ledger hidden behind loose boards. Written in a cramped hand, the entries listed dates and brief notes. Meal served, company silent, brother satisfied. Several entries were signed only with the initials W.D. The document was taken into custody, but curiously, no photographs or complete transcripts survive. Portions of the ledger were later destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1902, leaving only secondary references in affidavits. Folklore later exaggerated these discoveries, but even in the stripped-down details, the implications were chilling. A respected rancher, eating in seclusion, served meals by a young woman who believed she was feeding not one man but two, one of them perhaps his own brother, hidden from public view. The deputies searched for physical remains, but aside from fragments in the soil, they found little. No full graves, no clear evidence of identity. Some believed Davenport had removed bodies during the delay caused by spring flooding. Others suggested the cellar had been used not to conceal, but to process, leaving little behind. Walter Davenport maintained his composure throughout. When confronted with the ledger, he claimed it was a private record of meals taken during bouts of illness, nothing more. "I suffer from the stomach," he explained, "and my brother once tended me. The words are private shorthand." When asked about his brother, he refused to give a name or place, only replying, "The matter is family, not for public curiosity." The community was divided. Some demanded his arrest, pointing to the disappearances and evidence in the cellar. Others, wary of confronting a man of means, advised caution, arguing that rumors could destroy reputations without proof. Sheriff Blair, though unsettled, admitted his case was thin without bodies. The coroner could not confirm the bone fragments as human beyond doubt. The ledger, while suggestive, was ambiguous enough to be dismissed as eccentric record-keeping. Meanwhile, the ranch began to empty. Servants left quietly, refusing to stay after nightfall. Travelers avoided the road that passed the Davenport property, and in town, the comparisons to the bloody Benders grew louder. In taverns and at church steps, people muttered, "Kansas soil remembers its horrors. Perhaps it bears them again." What followed in the summer would only deepen the mystery, as Davenport himself began to withdraw from sight, and stories of his brother, seen fleetingly at windows or moving behind curtains, spread like wildfire. Through the summer of 1896, the Davenport Ranch took on a reputation that unsettled even hardened ranchers. Travelers reported seeing a tall figure in the windows late at night, sometimes Davenport, but other times a second man, similar in stature but gaunter, his features never clear. One passing salesman swore in an affidavit that he glimpsed a face, pale as chalk, peering from behind the curtain in the east chamber. When he knocked, only Walter answered the door, assuring him he was mistaken. Rumors spread that Walter's brother was alive and concealed within the house, unseen except for shadows and fleeting movements. Davenport himself neither confirmed nor denied this, telling the sheriff during one visit, "Family matters are not to be public affairs." This cryptic statement fueled speculation that some darker kinship tied him to the vanishings. Meanwhile, disappearances mounted. A boy of 16, hired as a stable hand, vanished after being sent to fetch supplies from the barn. The sheriff's men found only his cap in the dirt. A schoolteacher traveling from Emporia, known to stop at farmhouses for rest, was reported missing on her route, last seen near Cedarvale. Her body was never found. At this point, the sheriff petitioned the county court to place Davenport under formal investigation. The request stalled, partly due to Davenport's influence and partly because evidence remained circumstantial. Without bodies, charges could not stick. Davenport's attorney argued that suspicion and superstition are not law. The court agreed. Still, whispers persisted. Some claimed to hear noises from beneath the earth, moans or cries carried on the wind. Others swore that when Eliza Monroe disappeared, they saw her walking with a lantern along the creek bed near the Davenport land, as if fleeing, though she never appeared in town again. The butler, Gregory Ames, who had ear, liar spoken of rooms best left closed, was rumored to be spotted in Kansas City under an assumed name. A detective who pursued the lead reported that Ames spoke of dark suppers and a brother who would not die. But the detective later recanted, claiming the man was not Ames at all. The trail ended in confusion. By 1897, the Davenport estate was regarded much like the Bender homestead of the 1870s, whispered about, avoided, and cited as proof that Kansas soil could hide terrible secrets. Writers in later decades drew parallels between the cases, noting that both involved hidden rooms, disappearances, and a family whose secrets remained buried. The Kansas State Journal remarked in a retrospective, "The Benders fled, but Davenport stayed, cloaked in civility, while shadows worked in his halls." As the century closed, Walter Davenport began traveling under aliases. Records from Missouri and Oklahoma mention a W.D. Harper purchasing land, though no clear identity could be proven. Some suggested he was attempting to move his operations elsewhere. Others insisted the sightings were fabricated, meant to keep the legend alive. Back at Cedarvale, the house itself seemed to reflect its reputation. Windows were boarded by nervous caretakers, shutters banged in the wind, and the once manicured grounds fell into neglect. Children dared each other to approach the gates, whispering that the housekeeper still walked its halls with a plate in her hands. The sheriff, weary and aging, admitted defeat in his final note on the case. The Davenport matter remains unresolved. Proof is lacking, yet silence surrounds him. It is as though the house itself consumes the truth. By the turn of the century, the Davenport ranch had slipped into decline. Walter Davenport appeared less and less in public, and when he did, he seemed diminished, gaunt, hollow-eyed, yet still dressed with precision in his dark suits. Local accounts suggest he no longer rode out to oversee the herds, leaving the ranch hands to fend for themselves. Some left without collecting wages, muttering that the land was not safe by nightfall. The county assessor's records from 1899 note that the property had lost nearly half its value. Barns stood in disrepair, and the surrounding pastures lay overgrazed. Yet inside the house, witnesses described a strange contrast. A tradesman who delivered a new mantel clock testified that the dining room was immaculately maintained, candles arranged on the long oak table, plates polished until they gleamed. He remarked that Davenport asked for delivery after dark and insisted the clock be placed in view of the dining room chair. He sat there, the tradesman said, as though waiting for someone unseen. Whispers about the brother grew louder. Some claimed to have seen him walking the grounds at dusk, thin, stooped, moving with an odd gait. One woman, Margaret Yates, swore she saw two men together by the stables, their resemblance so striking she thought them twins. But in her later affidavit she admitted, "Perhaps I mistook shadows. It was near twilight." In 1900, the sheriff mounted what would be his last attempt to gather evidence. Deputies entered the cellar again, this time prying deeper into the stone walls. Behind one crumbling section, they discovered a cavity containing broken furniture, rusted chains, and scraps of stained cloth. The coroner described the stains as organic in nature. Still, no bodies were found. The sheriff noted grimly, "It is a chamber of use, not of storage." But the case again faltered. Davenport denied all allegations, claiming the cellar had been used decades earlier for livestock slaughter. Without concrete remains, prosecutors had nothing. And then, in the spring of 1901, Walter Davenport vanished. His carriage was found abandoned on the road to Wichita, horses grazing calmly nearby. Inside were personal effects: his watch, a ledger, and a half-written letter addressed simply to brother. The letter's contents were cryptic. "I have kept faith. Silence is preserved. Should I not return, the burden lies with you." No trace of him was ever found. Some said he fled under a new name, continuing his grim practices elsewhere. Others believed he was swallowed by the very secrets he had tried to guard. A few even whispered that his brother, if such a figure existed, turned on him at last. The ranch, left empty, fell into ruin. Windows shattered in storms, weeds overtook the porch, and the once proud Davenport name faded from county records. By the time of the courthouse fire in 1902, many of the most damning documents, sheriff's logs, affidavits, fragments of the ledger, were lost. Historians who reviewed the case decades later often compared its vanishing trail to the Bloody Benders, who likewise left behind more questions than answers. Both stories, they argued, revealed the uneasy line between law, rumor, and legend on the Kansas frontier. But while the Bender homestead was eventually destroyed, the Davenport house remained standing, a relic avoided by locals, yet always present on the horizon. And with every generation, new whispers began to grow around its walls. After Walter Davenport's disappearance, the ranch became less a residence and more a symbol. By 1905, no family claimed it, and no tenant lasted more than a few weeks. Caretakers hired by the county reported unease, doors opening on their own, faint clinks of silverware from the dining room when the house was empty. One caretaker, in a statement preserved by his descendants, wrote, "I was sent to watch a building, but what I felt was watching me." Local folklore blossomed quickly. Children dared one another to approach the gates at dusk, whispering that the housekeeper still roamed the halls with a plate in her hands. Farmwives told stories of hearing voices carried on the wind, half arguments, half prayers. Men traveling alone often chose longer routes rather than pass the Davenport Road after dark. By the 1910s, the tale had become a staple of Kansas frontier ghost lore. Newspapers occasionally printed sensational pieces, especially when new vanishings occurred in the region. Inevitably, Davenport's name would resurface, tied to whatever mystery was at hand: a missing trapper in 1912, a drifter lost in 1916. Each was linked by rumor to the cursed house near Cedarvale. Scholars reviewing these accounts decades later pointed out how often the legend was reshaped by earlier horrors. The shadow of the Bloody Benders, whose crimes in Labette County had shocked Kansas only 20 years before Davenport's rise, provided a model that locals applied to his mystery. Where the Benders had their trapdoor and shallow graves, Davenport's house had its locked dining room, its brother in the shadows, its ledger of cryptic meals. But beneath the folklore, scraps of record still hint at something grim. In 1924, a professor from Emporia State collected oral histories in the region. An elderly man, once a deputy under Sheriff Blair, told him, "We could never prove it, but I swear the bones in that soil were not from cattle." Another recalled Eliza Monroe by name, claiming she was seen in Wichita after her disappearance, though no record confirms it. Was she a victim, a fugitive, or complicit in what she served? No one knew. The Davenport house itself aged into ruin. Photographs from the 1930s show broken shutters, vines climbing the porch, and one shuttered window on the upper floor still intact, as though preserved. Locals believed that window belonged to the brothers' room, a place never entered by law or caretaker. Hunters reported hearing footsteps overhead while they camped near the property. In one chilling anecdote, a traveler claimed to see a young woman's reflection in that very window. though the house was supposed to be empty. As the years stretched on, the legend hardened. Teachers warned children not to wander near the property. Preachers invoked Davenport as a cautionary tale against secrecy and pride. Writers of Kansas folklore included it alongside the Benders, weaving both into a tradition of frontier horror. Yet, in contrast to the Benders, who had been hunted across states, Davenport simply dissolved, swallowed by the prairie or hidden by his wealth. Still, the story refused to fade. As late as the 1950s, locals swore the cellar walls still bore marks too deep to be dismissed as farm work. Visitors reported feeling their hair stand on end as they crossed the threshold, the silence inside broken only by the ticking of that old mantel clock, long stopped yet still set in its place at the dining table. The legend had entered a new phase, no longer a crime to be solved, but a haunting presence woven into Kansas memory. By the mid-20th century, the Davenport case had become less of an active memory and more of a curiosity for researchers, professors, and collectors of frontier lore. In 1952, Professor Harold Crenshaw of the University of Kansas undertook a small project cataloging unsolved crimes of the state's past. Among his files, later preserved in the university archives, is a thin folder labeled simply Davenport Walter, Cedar Vale. Crenshaw's notes reveal his frustration. Much of the original documentation was gone, destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1902. Surviving pieces were scattered, sheriff's log fragments, one brittle copy of a Gazette editorial, and several oral histories gathered in the 1920s. What struck him most, however, was the ledger fragment said to have been removed from the cellar. The original was missing, but secondary descriptions agreed on one haunting entry, "Brother satisfied." In his field notes, Crenshaw compared Davenport's mystery to the infamous Bloody Benders. He wrote, "Both cases arise in isolation, both bear marks of concealed family ties, and both end in disappearance rather than resolution. Kansas, it seems, harbors tales that resist conclusion." The professor's choice to tie Davenport so firmly to the Benders ensured the two legends would remain linked in the public imagination. Locals in the 1950s still regarded the Davenport house with unease. Hunters passing the property claimed to hear clattering from inside, as though dishes were being stacked. One farmer reported seeing lamplight glowing faintly in an upper window during a thunderstorm, though no one had lived there in decades. A sheriff's deputy, skeptical of such claims, conducted a brief inspection in 1956. His report, a single page, described the interior as dusty, collapsed in places, yet strangely ordered in the dining hall. He noted the mantel clock still sat at the head of the table, its hands frozen at midnight. Folklorists collecting stories in the 1960s recorded eerie variations. In one version, Davenport had kept his brother hidden due to illness or deformity, feeding him in secret until desperation led to murder. In another, the brother was already dead, his body preserved or imagined, and Eliza Monroe was tricked into serving meals to an empty chair. A third, whispered among older residents, suggested that the housekeeper herself was complicit, playing a role in feeding the master his brother's flesh. Crenshaw tried to filter these accounts, distinguishing fact from embellishment. He concluded that while folklore had exaggerated, the pattern of disappearances surrounding the ranch could not be denied. In an unpublished manuscript, he wrote, "We may never know what was eaten at that table, but the silence in the record is itself damning." His work reignited interest. Newspapers printed short retrospectives, linking the Davenport case to Kansas's long tradition of frontier mysteries. Amateur investigators visited the ruins, photographing cellar walls and measuring scorings in the stone. None could prove their theories, but the legend deepened. Through these mid-century examinations, the Davenport mystery gained a second life, not as a solvable crime, but as a living echo of Kansas's darker history, stitched permanently alongside the tale of the Benders. The story was no longer about evidence, but about what evidence refused to yield. By the 1970s, the Davenport Ranch was no longer just an abandoned property. It had become a destination for those chasing ghost stories. Teenagers from Cedarvale and Fairbrook dared each other to sneak onto the grounds at night, carrying lanterns or flashlights, whispering that if they reached the dining room and sat in Davenport's chair, they would hear footsteps on the stair. Many swore they did. A group of college students from Wichita State conducted an informal investigation in 1974, recording their impressions on cassette. The tape, which survives in fragments, contains hushed voices describing a smell like damp iron in the cellar and the sound of cutlery rattling, though we touched nothing. On playback, one section of the tape captured a faint knock, followed by a voice none of them recognized. They abandoned the site after that, leaving the recorder behind. Hikers passing the property in the 1980s described a peculiar phenomenon: the sudden stopping of wind when nearing the house. Prairie grass, bending in steady gusts, would fall still within 50 yards of the structure, as though the air itself hesitated to enter. Others reported shadows moving across windows long boarded shut. One hiker wrote in a letter later printed in the Topeka Daily Capital, "The window pane glowed as if with lamplight, but there was no opening inside for it to shine from." Local historians tried to push back against sensationalism, insisting the Davenport tale was no more than rumor exaggerated by time. Yet even they could not ignore the recurring accounts of unease tied to the site. One professor remarked, "Legends endure when they fulfill a need. Kansas already had the Benders, but Davenport offered a reminder that evil might wear wealth as easily as rags." The folklore adapted to modern sensibilities. Where earlier generations whispered of a hidden brother, new storytellers suggested the figure seen at the window was Davenport himself, still waiting, still seated at the table. Others claimed the housekeeper had never left, her spirit bound to the duty of serving plates to an endless guest. Skeptics dismissed these tales as imagination fueled by the decayed grandeur of the house, but they admitted the building held a peculiar atmosphere difficult to explain away. By the 1990s, the property had been purchased by a ranching cooperative, though they never used the main house. Repairs were attempted, but workers refused to stay overnight. One carpenter quit after hearing what he described as a cough behind me, low and rasping, though he was alone. Another swore he saw a pale hand withdraw from the upstairs curtain. The repairs ceased, and the house was left once again to weather. Even today, hikers and travelers tell of the Davenport ruins as a place where silence grows heavy, where the prairie seems to dim around its walls. Some leave offerings on the gatepost, coins, dried flowers, even a plate of bread, as though appeasing a presence that remains hungry. The house stands not merely as a ruin, but as a reminder that history's shadows do not always end with tidy resolutions. In Kansas, the Davenport name lingers, woven into local memory as both crime and haunting, fact and folklore, proof and uncertainty. In the early 2000s, a wave of renewed interest in Kansas's forgotten crimes brought researchers back to Cedarvale. Graduate students in history and anthropology began revisiting the Davenport case, piecing together whatever fragments could still be found in courthouse ledgers, private family archives, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Their findings added little certainty, but deepened the sense of ambiguity that had always surrounded the story. One researcher, Anna Kessler, tracked down descendants of ranch hands who once worked for Davenport. In interviews, she recorded oral traditions passed down through families. A great-grandson of a worker claimed, "My grandfather said the master always locked his door to eat, but one night he caught sight of another man at the table. He swore it was not Walter, but someone thinner, with hollow cheeks, eating like a starved animal." Another family recalled their ancestors' warning, "Do not let your boys work that land. The house eats more than cattle." Skeptics in the community pushed back. A retired sheriff from the county suggested the entire case was inflated by hysteria, pointing out that frontier records are riddled with disappearances, travelers lost to weather, robbery, or simple misadventure. "Every county has its ghost story," he told a local paper, "and this one happened to have Davenport's name on it." But even he admitted that the number of vanishings near the estate was unusually high compared to neighboring properties. Folklorists revisiting the site noted how strongly the Davenport legend mirrored the Bloody Benders, still one of the most notorious Kansas crimes of the 19th century. The parallel was too neat to ignore. An isolated homestead, a respected family, and disappearances that pointed inward rather than outward. Yet where the Benders left behind undeniable graves, the Davenports left only fragments, wispies, and a ledger of unsettling notes. Researchers attempted forensic surveys of the property in 2007, using ground-penetrating radar in areas where disturbed soil had once been reported. The results were inconclusive, pockets of irregularity beneath the stables, but nothing definitive enough to prove graves. The survey team noted anomalies consistent with fill and refilling, suggesting someone had dug repeatedly in those areas over time. Local residents remained divided. Some wanted the house demolished, calling it an eyesore and a magnet for trespassers. Others insisted it should remain standing, a tangible piece of the region's dark history. At a town hall meeting, one elderly resident spoke with conviction. "Tear it down, and you will not end it. The story will walk whether the walls stand or not." Even today, Cedar Vale struggles with the Davenport legacy. Historical societies file it under unresolved, tour guides mention it in hushed tones, and local children still dare each other to touch the iron gate at midnight. A few claim that if you linger too long, you'll hear the faint scrape of a chair across the dining room floor, just as Eliza Monroe once described in her final letters. The legend survives not because it was proven, but because it was never disproven. And in that gap, imagination and fear continue to thrive. By the 2010s, the Davenport Ranch had attracted a new kind of attention. Paranormal investigators and small documentary crews hoping to capture proof of the legend. With portable cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic sensors, they entered the ruins at night, retracing the steps of lawmen and servants from more than a century earlier. One of the earliest groups, the Kansas Paranormal Collective, published footage online in 2012. Their team reported strange fluctuations in temperature inside the dining room, where the air grew suddenly cold near the long oak table. On one recording, a faint clinking sound was captured, indistinguishable from utensils striking porcelain. Critics dismissed it as coincidence, yet the video spread widely, reigniting debate about the Davenport mystery. Another group claimed to hear whispered words in the cellar, though the audio was too distorted to decipher. They noted scratch marks on the stone walls, uneven in height, as if made by restless hands rather than tools. It felt less like a basement, one investigator said on camera, and more like a chamber where time had stopped. Documentary filmmakers who visited in 2016 tried to frame the story in historical terms rather than purely supernatural. They interviewed historians who emphasized the parallels with the Bloody Benders, whose story remains better documented. One scholar noted, "The Davenport case may never be proven, but the unease is real because it reminds us how many people vanished on the frontier with no record at all." Skeptics argued that the Davenport legend endures precisely because the evidence is incomplete. Without graves or confessions, the imagination fills in the void. Yet even skeptics admitted the details were troubling. The ledger with its cryptic entries, the sudden disappearances of servants, the refusal to open the cellar. One researcher put it bluntly, "If Davenport was innocent, why did he live as if haunted?" Folklore evolved with the times. Younger storytellers online spread versions where the brother was no longer a literal sibling but a symbol, representing guilt, hunger, or madness. Others kept the story literal, insisting that Davenport had hidden a deformed or violent brother and fed him in secret, with Eliza unknowingly delivering the meals. Still others twisted the tale darker, suggesting the meals themselves included human remains from the missing ranch hands. Through these retellings, the legend refused to die, and with each investigation, no matter how inconclusive, the sense of mystery deepened. Travelers continued to leave offerings at the gate, coins, bread, or notes asking for safe passage. Hunters still avoided camping within sight of the house, claiming the silence was too heavy. By the late 2010s, the Davenport ruins were listed in several guides to haunted Kansas, alongside abandoned churches and old mining towns. But unlike many sites, its reputation was not built on flashy ghost tales alone. It was rooted in missing names, in real families who never saw their sons, daughters, or neighbors return. That is what kept the Davenport legend from fading into mere entertainment. The silence inside its walls remains the loudest testimony. Today, the Davenport ruins stand as a weathered shell on the Kansas prairie, half-collapsed yet unmistakable in their outline. Travelers describe the approach as unnerving. The land grows oddly quiet, and even the wind seems reluctant to pass through. The main house leans slightly, boards grayed by sun and rain, but the frame of the dining room window still holds, like a watchful eye, on the empty fields. Locals continue to live in its shadow. Some ranchers warn their children not to venture near, telling them that house has taken more than it's given. Others embrace the story, guiding curious visitors to the overgrown path and retelling the tale as part of Kansas's darker heritage. The local library in Fairbrook maintains a small file labeled Davenport Materials, containing clippings, affidavits, and typed notes from earlier researchers. Though slim, the file is often requested by college students working on projects about folklore or frontier crime. Among older residents, the memory of Davenport lingers like an heirloom passed through generations. A woman in her 80s, interviewed in 2019, recalled how her father refused to ride past the ranch after dark. He said it wasn't the ghost you feared, she explained. It was the silence, that silence that held something back. Another resident claimed his grandfather once camped too close to the ruins and woke to the sound of a chair scraping slowly across a floor. When he opened his tent, the house was dark, yet the sound continued, echoing in the night air. The story has become part of local identity, just as the Bloody Benders remain part of Kansas's grim legacy. The two names are often mentioned together at historical talks, as if one cannot be spoken without recalling the other. Both tales remind listeners that the frontier was not only about freedom and opportunity, but also isolation, secrecy, and the ease with which people could vanish. Tourists sometimes ask why the Davenport house was never torn down, as so many ruins eventually are. The answer varies. Some say it's because no one wanted to buy the land. Others insist attempts were made, but always abandoned after workers quit. A historian once remarked, "The house survives because it was meant to. Until the story is finished, the walls will not fall." To this day, offerings are still found at the gatepost, coins stacked neatly, jars of grain, or folded notes tucked between rusted iron bars. No one admits to leaving them, yet they appear without fail, as if some quiet agreement exists between the living and the legend. Hikers report a peculiar feeling upon placing something there, an immediate easing of the heaviness in the air, as though acknowledged by whatever lingers within. And still, questions remain unanswered. Was there truly a hidden brother? Did Eliza Munro flee? Or was she swallowed by the same silence as the others? Were the fragments of bone merely animal remains, or grim proof carefully erased by fire and time? The record refuses to close, leaving only speculation, testimony, and the heavy weight of rumor. The Davenport story is not just history. It is a reminder that some parts of the past refuse to stay buried, and some houses refuse to let go of what they once held. In recent years, the Davenport ruins have become a quiet test of courage for younger generations. Teenagers from Cedarvale and Fairbrook still slip through gaps in the fence on moonless nights, drawn by a mixture of defiance and fear. Many bring their phones to capture video, though few keep the footage for long. One boy admitted in an interview, "We filmed inside the dining room, but the sound messed up. Static, popping, like forks hitting plates. We deleted it. Didn't want it on my phone." Law enforcement has occasionally issued warnings about trespassing, citing the building's instability, but officers themselves admit unease. A deputy who entered during a daylight patrol described a thick stillness in the cellar and the sudden scent of something metallic, though the air was clear. He declined to stay longer than necessary, later telling colleagues, "It wasn't fear of collapse that pushed me out. It was the feeling of being expected." Some reports verge on the uncanny. In 2017, a pair of hikers camping near the property claimed they heard the unmistakable scrape of a chair moving slowly across wood, followed by the faint clink of glass. They shined lights toward the house, but no reflection came from the windows. Their written statement ends with the line, "It was not a ghost story we felt, it was a supper without hosts." Local paranormal groups continue to investigate, though many acknowledge the mystery may never yield proof. Recordings capture noises easily dismissed as wind or old timber, but the atmosphere, described repeatedly as oppressive, watchful, expectant, remains consistent across generations. Even skeptics admit the house has a presence. Maybe it's not haunted, one historian mused, but it remembers. Connections to the Bloody Benders still surface in conversations. Scholars point out how the two legends mirror one another across time. Disappearances, isolation, a family's guarded privacy, and the lingering absence of resolution. The Benders left graves, the Davenports left silence. In both, Kansas bore witness to darkness beneath ordinary facades. Folklore continues to shift, as folklore always does. Some storytellers frame Davenport's brother as an allegory for hidden sins, something concealed that grew hungry until it consumed others. Others keep it literal, a hidden sibling, malformed or criminal, fed in secret until discovery was inevitable. The version told depends on the teller, but the unease is always the same. Visitors often describe an inexplicable heaviness upon crossing the threshold. A journalist who toured the site in 2020 noted that her watch stopped ticking the moment she stepped into the dining room, only to resume once she left. She wrote in her article, "It may have been coincidence, but in that silence, coincidence feels like confession." And still the house stands, shattered roof lines, crooked beams, and that dining room window, unbroken, staring across the prairie as if keeping watch. When modern historians attempt to summarize the Davenport case, they often admit defeat. Too many records are gone, too many witnesses long buried, too many facts blurred by the haze of rumor. Yet the pattern remains difficult to dismiss. People disappeared. Servants left in fear. A sheriff's notes describe things that could not be explained away as imagination. And a ledger, perhaps the most damning artifact of all, contained lines that still chill readers. "Brother, satisfied." The parallels to the Bloody Benders persist because they strike the same nerve. Both stories remind us how isolation on the frontier could allow horrors to flourish undetected. But unlike the Benders, who were chased from their home and exposed, Walter Davenport seemed to retreat into silence and vanish, leaving behind only suspicion. It is this absence of resolution that keeps his name alive in Kansas folklore. Descendants of those who lived near the ranch continue to pass on fragments. One family in Fairbrook claims their great-grandmother saw Eliza Monroe alive years later in Wichita, working under another name. Another insists she never left the house at all, that her spirit walks the upstairs hall even now, carrying a plate into a locked room. Oral history does not settle questions. It multiplies them. In 2018, a panel discussion at the Kansas Historical Society revisited the Davenport case. Scholars debated whether he was a criminal, a misunderstood recluse, or the victim of legend layered upon tragedy. One speaker noted, "We must remember that for all the stories there were real people who vanished. Their names appear in ledgers, in affidavits, in letters to the sheriff. We do not have their graves, but we have their absence. That is evidence too." Visitors to the ruins still describe the feeling of being watched from the dining room window. Some insist they hear footsteps matching their own as they move through the halls. Others say the air grows heavy, as if holding a memory too dense to disperse. In one modern account, a traveler claimed to hear a woman's voice whisper, "Not for you," as he reached for the cellar door. He fled without looking back. The legend has become more than a ghost story. It is a meditation on secrecy, wealth, and the hidden lives that frontier isolation could conceal. Whether Davenport was guilty of crimes or merely the focus of suspicion, his house became a vessel for Kansas's darkest anxieties. The prairie holds its share of forgotten tragedies, but few are recalled with such intensity more than a century later. And always, the story returns to the dining table. The polished oak, the stopped clock, the empty chair said to scrape across the floor when no one is near. It is here the narrative circles, as if refusing to let us leave without acknowledging the unease that began it all. A housekeeper serving plates to a man who may not have been alone. In the 2020s, Cedarvale remains a small place, and the Davenport ruins are more symbol than structure. Most of the roof has collapsed, and the cellar is nearly inaccessible, half filled with earth and rainwater. Yet the stories have not faded. If anything, the decay has sharpened their edge, as if the walls themselves are whispering their own slow confession. A handful of modern testimonies add to the mystery. A local rancher told a visiting journalist in 2021 that he saw a light flicker in the upper window one winter evening. It was steady, he said, like a lantern carried across the room. But when I walked closer, the house was still, not a pane of glass left whole in that frame. Another claimed his hunting dog refused to go past the fence line, barking until pulled back, then falling silent as if cowed. In town, younger residents treat the Davenport story as part of their identity, half pride, half dread. Halloween tours include hushed retellings, with guides warning visitors not to mock the house. It listens, one guide says softly before moving on. Some high school students film amateur horror shorts on the grounds, using the cellar door as a prop. Yet even these staged visits often end abruptly, with someone unnerved enough to call it off. Researchers from Kansas State revisited the property in 2022, not for paranormal study, but to map its remaining structure. Their report describes unusual wear in the dining room floorboards, consistent with repeated movement of heavy furniture. They also noted the mantel clock, still preserved in place after more than a century of storms and abandonment. The team leader later admitted in a lecture, "I don't believe in ghosts, but the dining room felt like a space still in use. It was difficult to shake the sense of intrusion." The story continues to shift in the telling. Some emphasize Davenport's wealth and privacy, framing him as a man whose secrets destroyed him. Others focus on Eliza Monroe, the housekeeper whose letters and diary fragments provide the most human window into the events. Was she a victim, a survivor, or something else entirely? Her fate remains one of the cruelest mysteries of all. Yet for all the interpretations, one detail unites them: the idea of the brother. Whether literal or symbolic, whether hidden in flesh or conjured in Davenport's mind, the brother is the figure that will not vanish. The ledger's phrase, "brother satisfied," echoes still in every retelling. Some believe it meant a sibling fed in secrecy. Others believe it signaled cannibalistic horror, the rancher fed with his own kin's remains. The ambiguity ensures the legend can never close. And so the Davenport story persists, not as fact, not as fiction, but as something in between. A shadow cast across Kansas soil, impossible to pin down, yet impossible to forget. Every attempt to resolve the Davenport case circles back to the same absence. No bodies, no confession, no trial. What remains are fragments, letters, affidavits, rumors, that together form a picture too sharp to dismiss and too blurred to prove. For over a century, Cedarvale has carried the burden of that uncertainty. Folklorists often point out how legends survive not because they are solved, but because they resist solution. The Bloody Benders, with their confirmed graves, became history. Walter Davenport, with his vanished records and ambiguous traces, became something else, a story that hovers between crime and myth. This is why his name is still spoken in Kansas, long after others have faded. Local residents still feel the weight. One man whose family ranches nearby confessed in 2023, "We don't talk about it much, but we don't build close to that road either. There's ground there that doesn't want to be disturbed." Another, younger, said she refuses to walk past the gate at night, convinced she once heard a woman's voice whisper her name in the dark. The story has even entered academic discussion. In a seminar on frontier folklore, a professor described the Davenport case as an archive of silence. He argued that what matters is not what we know, but what we cannot know. That the ledger's words, the sheriff's missing files, and the housekeeper's disappearance point to the limits of historical record itself. The Davenport story, he said, is Kansas reminding us that history can hide as much as it reveals. Visitors to the site often describe the same experience, an oppressive quiet, as though the prairie itself is holding its breath. Some swear that if you stand by the dining room window, you hear the scrape of a chair or the faint clink of a fork. Others dismiss it as the groan of old wood, the trick of settling beams. But even skeptics admit the house compels attention. It demands that you consider the stories told within its walls. And always, the figure of the brother remains. Was he real, concealed in the locked rooms of the Davenport home? Was he already dead, a memory Walter kept alive through ritual suppers? Or was he an invention of the townsfolk, a shadow created to explain vanishings that had no simpler answer? No testimony resolves the question, and perhaps none ever will. Kansas carries the legacy of its frontier crimes, and Davenport's tale sits alongside the Benders in that uneasy archive. Where the Benders left behind bodies, Davenport left behind silence, and silence can be more haunting than any grave. Today, the Davenport ruins are little more than broken stone, collapsed beams, and the frame of that notorious dining room window. Grass and vines have crept into the cellar, and storms have claimed most of the roof. Yet anyone who walks past will tell you, the house does not feel empty. Travelers on the road at night still speak of lights faintly flickering where no lamp could possibly burn. Hikers report sudden chills when crossing the fence line, or the uncanny sensation of footsteps behind them that stop when they stop. A few claim to hear the faint scrape of a chair drawn slowly back from a table as though waiting for someone to sit. Locals know better than to mock. They leave the place alone, sometimes leaving offerings at the gate, bread, coins, or even small plates of food. These tokens vanish, though whether by animals or something else, no one can say. The act itself seems to matter more than the result, as if the living are still in quiet negotiation with the silence of that house. Historians remind us that legends often survive not because they are fully believed, but because they speak to something deeper. The Davenport story, like that of the bloody Benders before it, is less about proof than about possibility. The possibility that beneath the surface of wealth and civility, something darker can thrive. The frontier was vast, the law was thin, and isolation could hide terrible things. Whether Walter Davenport was a criminal mastermind, a deluded recluse, or the unwilling host of something stranger, we cannot know. What we do know is this: people vanished. Servants fled in fear. Records hint at secrets that were never resolved. And a young housekeeper, Eliza Monroe, wrote words that still echo across more than a century. I serve not one but two. Kansas carries many stories in its soil, some celebrated, some forgotten, and some that linger like a dow no sunlight can erase. The Davenport tale belongs to that last category. It has no ending, no justice, no grave. Only whispers, fragments, and a house that will not let its silence go. If you ever find yourself in Cedar Vale, and the night is still, stand at the edge of the Davenport ruins. Listen carefully. You may hear nothing at all, or you may hear the scrape of a chair, the clink of a fork, the sound of a supper laid for someone who was never meant to be seen. And then perhaps you will understand why the people of Kansas still avoid that road after dark.